Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody who's made the time for today's call. Hopefully in the location you're sitting and listening in on this webinar from is weather that's as gorgeous as it is here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So thanks to all for making time for today's call. The purpose of today's call is to offer some tips to adjust strategy when leading through the current adversity that we're all working and living through, from adversity to recovery. Now, on the call today, we've got a number of presenters and actually one guest presenter who's not showing up on the screen here. But to kick things off, Scott, would you like to say a hello and an introduction of yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well on this Friday afternoon. I'm one of the senior partners with the Envision Group, and I've had the pleasure of working with Pat and Bob and Hugh on a number of different engagements. And we've delivered this presentation or this webinar now to just, I guess, 1,500 to 2,000 people. And the feedback that we're getting is that this is valuable information at an important time. We're very lucky to have the opportunity to share the learning and experience of people like Bob Peterson and Hugh Dunleavy. So looking forward to an interactive session this afternoon.
All right, thanks, Scott. And on the line, we have Bob Peterson, a strategy consultant in the oil and gas industry for over 40 years. Bob, if you don't mind giving an introduction as well.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Thank you for all spending a little bit of time with us today. As Pat has said, I've spent about 40 years in the energy industry. Started out long ago in the late 70s with Mobil and then ExxonMobil, primarily international operations, business development, and research and development. Went off into the consulting world about 18 years ago, worked for various consulting firms, and joined the Envision Group a couple of years ago as a senior partner. I have lived through in my energy career now 4 serious price disruptions and now 3 pandemics, this one being the worst of the 3, but never have both a pandemic and a price disruption coincided. So significant, unique event to our industry that is definitely going to permanently change how we work and how the industry is structured. I've been through a lot of restructuring, growing companies, shrinking companies, mergers and acquisitions. And so I'm going to relay a bit of my experience in leading teams and businesses through periods of significant, rapid change.
All right, thanks very much for that, Bob. We'll hear from you in just a few minutes as well. Now, I believe, Hugh, Dr. Dunleavy, you're on the line here as well?
Yes, I am, Pat.
Okay, welcome, and I can see you're sailing, so thank you for joining the web call here as well. It's always fun on a Friday, but if you don't mind, in all sincerity, if you don't mind a brief introduction as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Not sure if everyone's on the same time zone, but my name's Hugh Dunleavy. I've been working in the airline industry for approximately 40 years. Stopped working with Qatar Airways as their chief commercial officer, and have been working with Pat for the past 2 years or so. So most of my background is in the aviation space, but the topic that will probably be most relevant to us this afternoon is the time I spent as chief commercial officer at Malaysia Airlines, where we had to deal with the 2 long-term tragedies associated with the loss of MH370 and then the shooting down of MH17. So these were very unique scenarios, and the impact of the airline was extensive for an extended period of time. And I think there's a lot of relevance there to what we're seeing now with the pandemic and the oil situation. With that, back to you, Pat.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And again, my name, to those who don't know me, I'm Pat Lipovski. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Envision Group. We're a firm that literally travels around the world dealing primarily in the oil and gas industry, airline industry, technology, and healthcare. And it's interesting because many of the people who are on the line today, we've had touch points with you. And I got to say, the lineup of people who are on the call is actually quite substantial. We've got some exceptional talent on the call. from C-level executives right to leaders of organizations at the level that you're at. Now, it's interesting because as we go through today's presentation, the intention is to walk through some tools and tactics for each one of us to put the oxygen mask on first, metaphorically speaking, and to ensure that we've got some strategies to lead ourselves, to lead our teams and families, and to lead our organizations through to recovery and hopefully to resumption. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, one other gentleman that's on the call here was actually worked together with Dr. Dunleavy at Malaysia Airlines. Dean Dacko, you're on the line here from Toronto. Do you want to give a brief introduction of yourself as well, please? And I think you may just be on mute there as well. Okay, Dean. Yeah, what we'll do, Dean, is we'll come back to you in just a moment.
I think
thank you very much. Okay, go ahead, please, Dean.
Guys. Yeah, very thankful to be on the call today. Certainly, in respect to giving some insight and some understanding of and further, I guess, providing a broader picture of what Hugh and I both experienced when two of the most unprecedented events in aviation history happened within several weeks of each other. Completely devastating to a company, to a country, and to a large degree, how airlines were managing these kinds of things, and obviously with the complete disappearance of an aircraft, something that never had ever happened before, hopefully never again since. But the impact on that on a number of different audiences was devastating, and certainly there was a lot of learning that came out of it that I think is relevant for today's discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Dean. And essentially what we have set for today's agenda, beyond introductions, we have an example, and of course the example is the Malaysia Airlines story. And I think I've got a little bit of an echo on from somebody. I'm not sure if you can go on mute here as well. Okay, so essentially looking from the example of leading from adversity to recovery, we're looking at, again, leading yourself, leading your teams, and respectfully families and communities, and finally leading organizations, drawing on the perspective. Scott, Donald, and I will be drawing on the perspective of Hugh, Dean, and Bob in terms of their learnings and their experience in helping organizations and leaders at all levels navigate that change. Now, it's interesting because, Dean, Hugh, it's interesting because looking at the image that's on the screen right now, that is actually the MH370 that was taken, of course, before it went missing. But, Hugh, you and I have talked many times, and one morning you were driving out to the airport, 4:30 in the morning, your cell phone rang, and life as you know it changed. Can you take it from there?
Yes. It's difficult to know where to start with this, but the reality is, although airlines train continuously to make sure that you're prepared for scenarios and for incidents, the one that faced us at Malaysia Airlines was unique. So received the call out, and because the emergency center was close to the airport and I happened to be out at the airport, I was able to get to that emergency center probably within 5 minutes of the call out. Immediately asked what's going on, and the situation at that point in time was that we had lost contact with the aircraft. No more information, no information from anyone else saying that there had been a plane crash anywhere, just that we've lost contact and we're doing the best we can using all means available, including neighboring airlines, air traffic control operators around the Southeast Asia region, trying to contact that aircraft, but unfortunately with no success. And from there, by about 9 o'clock in the morning, we had our first press conference. That was timed because it was meant to relate to the time the aircraft should have landed in Beijing. And once we knew that the aircraft had not landed and we'd been out of touch with it for 5 or 6 hours at that stage, we knew something bad had happened. We just didn't know where the aircraft was. Now, hindsight tends to be 20/20, but if you imagine yourself in that situation, you've got a missing aircraft somewhere, so you send out sea and air rescue. But in this case, we said, well, okay, great to do that, but we actually don't know where the incident happened. So we can't go back to Air Sea Rescue and say, please send out your ships and aircraft, because we had nowhere to go. So, and it went on from there. So around about midday, we managed to get another aircraft available, and myself and about 250 other colleagues, our first responders, took a flight to Beijing, landed there around close to midnight, went through all the usual processing. Chinese authorities were very helpful and accommodating, got us through all the immigration procedures and issued visas, which none of us had at that point in time, so that we could do a press conference in the main hotel in Beijing. So I'll stop there unless there's any questions that you'd like to go into more details, Pat.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's interesting because should anybody have any questions, once again, with the number of people on the call, it's tricky to have the two-way conversation. But what we'll ask is if you have questions as we go through this presentation, please do feel free to include them in the chat area. We'll be monitoring the chat. We'll bring your questions directly into the conversation. Now, it's interesting, Hugh, because the biggest question, we've literally delivered this presentation now to thousands of people. This is the most senior group we've actually presented to over the last number of months. So one of the biggest questions that always comes up is, again, have they ever found the aircraft, and do you believe they ever will?
So unfortunately, we have not found the aircraft. I know bits of wreckage have shown up on some of the islands off the east coast of Africa, but we have never found the aircraft itself. And the challenge we face is that the South Indian Ocean is somewhat remote. There's not a lot of activity down there. And the ocean is 8 kilometers deep, so 5 miles deep, and they're very mountainous. So how do you find something that's maybe a big aircraft, but it's tiny compared to the millions of square miles that you have in the South Indian Ocean? So I suspect it could be 50 years, could be 100 years, and someday someone will be doing some research in the area and they'll accidentally find it. But I think the chances of going out with a specific survey and trying to find the aircraft amongst the millions of square miles or hundreds of thousands of square miles to search is very remote indeed.
Absolutely. Now, Hugh, I'm not certain if you can adjust your camera so that we can see you, but it would be great if you could adjust that in any way. That would be great. Now, it's interesting because looking at the the whole time you were at Malaysia Airlines, and again, these images that we have on the screen right now, what an emotional period, not only for the people who are involved in the tragedy, but also for you as a leader. Can you tell us anything about that?
So when you have these type of tragedies, we had about 230 odd people on board that aircraft and when you go to the site where most of the family members are residing, in this case in the area around Beijing, they're incredibly upset. The emotional content is very high. Also, anger levels are very high because people naturally default into that mode as someone has done something to my family member, someone is to blame, and your role there is to bring your first responders to try and take care of people as well as you can. But you've got to get over that first barrier, which is that anger and emotional trauma that those people are going through. They don't really want to listen to you at that stage. They just want you to find their family members and bring them home safely, which unfortunately in these type of situations, that's not something you can do. I was very fortunate to have a great deal of support from the Chinese authorities in terms of hospitals, police, access to hotels, etc., and all of the emergency services they have in Beijing, which they provided to us to help us through this crisis. Other challenge that you don't normally appreciate is that obviously language. I don't happen to speak Mandarin, but fortunately in Malaysia we have a culture where 1/3 of the population are ethnic Chinese, 1/3 are Malay, and the other 1/3 are Indian ethnic origin. So a large number of our people, first responders, we selected specifically because they could speak Mandarin and then they could talk to the family members. However, in a lot of cases, we discovered that people just wanted you to feel their emotion. They knew I didn't speak Chinese, but they specifically wanted to speak to me. Even if I had a translator with me, it wasn't necessary to have a translator. It was the fact that someone from Malaysia Airlines was sitting down and listening to them, and afterwards someone can translate what was said. The important point was for me to sit with them and let them express their feelings. And you can see some of the pictures now of the type of activity you went through, typically 3 times a day, every day for the 3 months I was in Beijing addressing this type of issue. A lot of emotion, and you not only have to take care of the family members, but you've also got to take care of your own people. And the reason for that is that they're going to be in front of these people And if they're being stressed out, then they're not going to provide the necessary care and attention that they are supposed to be given to the family members. So also have to take care of your own people, make sure that they're well taken care of, get good sleep, and that at the end of the day, we would normally make sure if you're looking after people in the main hotel, then you went home to another hotel. They can't be in the same hotel because otherwise they'll never get a chance to rest. And we deliberately did that by rotating people through from one hotel to another so that they could get a break at the end of the day. These are very draining scenarios on the first responders. And I don't use that as an excuse, but it's something you have to be aware of when times are stressful. Make sure you take care of the people, otherwise they cannot take care of your customers or the people who are impacted by the event that you're dealing with.
You know, Hugh, so thank you for that, because it's interesting. Looking at some of these images, you can just see the emotion that's involved here. And of course, in a tragedy, you know, God forbid something like this never happens again. You're dealing with people, and the similarity right now, if you looked at what's happening with the world of COVID, the price shock of oil, there's a little emotion involved today too, isn't there?
Absolutely. You can see on this latest picture, the particularly bottom left, where people are hands in the air. These are people are very emotional and they're very angry, and they need someone to address their anger towards. Unfortunately for me, I was the one as the senior executive in Beijing. It was my responsibility to address that. Similarly, I'll give you an example that you will get what you will perceive as unrealistic demands on what they want to do. So when I first got there, the expectation that the family members have would that I would be giving them an update every 15 minutes on the search for the missing aircraft. Now, since the aircraft is missing over an ocean period of time and boats don't really travel that far in 15 minutes, that's obviously to us now a clearly unrealistic expectation. But it took us quite some time to negotiate with family members to say, maybe we'll give you an update at 9 o'clock in the morning, 12 noon and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, because that will give us at least some time to see if an aircraft has gone out, found anything, or a boat has traveled far enough that it's searching for a new area of the ocean. But it takes some time to negotiate that and get people to understand when they're not in the mindset that they want to understand. They're still extremely upset with you.
No, it's interesting, Hugh, and actually, Dean, if you don't mind popping into the conversation and just coming off of mute for a moment, you know, Dean, you're back in the office. Again, your position with Malaysia Airlines at the time was what again?
I was Senior Vice President of Marketing and Product.
Yeah.
Working in Hugh's department in commercial.
Now, it's interesting because back in the office, how do you describe the tone in the office, and really what did you do yourself to help lead people through in the early stages of this event?
Well, you know, it's interesting because as Hughes explained, you know, within about 6 hours, he was on an aircraft with 250 people over to Beijing and was there for 3 months. And dealing with a pretty, you know, incredible set of circumstances over there. But meanwhile, back in Kuala Lumpur, we were still, not only were we attempting to support and through the activities of the Emergency Operations Center, which we had 12-hour shifts and we were required to be in. But beyond that, we were still had the responsibility of operating an airline. And within the...
Oh, sorry, Dean, something happened. You muted out there.
Am I okay?
Yeah, you're back now. Thank you.
Okay. So within the first few hours of the event happening, we made a commercial decision that we were going to allow for cancellations, because we couldn't expect people to have comfort in flying when we had no idea where the aircraft was. So in the space of 10 days, we had 100,000 cancellations a day for 10 days. We lost $100 million a day for 10 days, so $1 billion in less than a week and a half. And we went completely, we called it a dark side. We took every asset that we had, marketing asset that we had, and we shut it down worldwide. We were basically dead in the water, and it was a notion of then trying to bring back some form of commercial activity without being offensive from a to be offensive to the families on on how could you be promoting something when you haven't found my wife, my daughter, my son. But at the same time, recognizing that you could not continue to lose $100 million a day without doing something about it. So the challenge for us back in Kuala Lumpur was to sort of balance between the activities around still trying to manage through what was completely an unprecedented event where we completely lost an aircraft, and at the same time trying to lead people and start to imagine how we were going to have some form of commercial recovery. And we needed to have a plan. We needed to have some sort of ideas about when we were and how we were going to start to turn a commercial operation back again. So it was an interesting balance.
And it's interesting, Dean, because, Hugh and I've talked about this too, because, roughly 3-4 months into dealing with the tragedy of MH370, what you're seeing on the screen right now is the actual MH17 being reconstructed after it was shot down over the Ukraine. So again, Hugh, you'd mentioned to me that you're going through your day-to-day business and you get a second phone call. And what was your reaction to the phone call about MH17?
Basically, I was incredulous. I said, this can't happen. This is not something that anyone jokes about. And the emergency ops center was reactivated. And they told me, here's what's happened. We know that an aircraft has been shot down over the Ukraine. We don't know which aircraft it is yet, but we can tell you that our pilots are not responding. And all of the other airlines that are on the same flight corridor are responding. So we can't prove it yet, but we believe it's our aircraft. And so therefore, we're activating all of our emergency response, and we'll take it from there. What made it more complex for us was that this wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate shoot down of a commercial aircraft, which is already transmitting with its responders. This is MH17, this is MH17. So definitely not an accident. And unfortunately, of course, you now have to deal with the political dimensions associated with a second aircraft being shot down. It's been shot down over a war zone, so why were you flying there? And everyone starts to point the finger, whereas in fact, the flight corridors that all airlines operate under are designated by the United Nations. And so not only were we flying down that same corridor, almost every European and Southeast Asian carrier that was operating into Europe, flying down to Southeast Asia, would have been on the same flight corridor. We just happened to be the one that was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot down. The issue, of course, is because it was a conflict zone on the ground, and we were informed by the United Nations that we were at a safe altitude, should not be any issues. That didn't turn out to be the case. And because of the conflict on the ground, we weren't able to get to the crash site for some 6 weeks after the shoot down event, which has its own challenges then in terms of recovering not only the remains of the passengers that were on board, but then also dealing with the various combatant groups in the region.
And it was quite a time for you. And you can see the image that's on the screen. Just imagine each one of us as leaders on the call here today. Just imagine having to face that 3 times a day for 3 straight months of media constantly looking for answers from you. I know from time to time, we feel like that when we come to work and people are approaching us for answers and for direction. But, what a time and what a situation. Now, what's interesting is on the screen right now, we have some of the main learnings. The main learnings, Hugh, that you've taken back. You've touched on some of these already, but if you looked at these learnings as everybody's reading through them on the webinar here right now, what do you think are the most important? Everything on here is important, but what really stands out most for you? And Dean, I'll come to you on the same thing.
Yeah, obviously everything is important, but there's 2 main roles as a leader you have to emphasize. One is you have to make sure people realize that, yes, we're going through a really tough time, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, so that people need to know that there is going to be a future out there, and when we'll be able to put this behind us. And at the same time, we realize that just because of our talking with the people in China and also the people in the Netherlands, communicate. So those are very important. The other issue we learned in this modern era where we have social media and instant communication of information, whether it's valid information or someone's conspiracy theories, you have to be able to respond very quickly. And I'll ask Dean to talk about that a little bit later. But one thing we learned basically was you need to know your facts And when you do present information to the recipients, be honest with them and say, here's what we know today. It's the best information we have available. New information will come in over the next 24 hours. It may change some of the things we've said today, but we're only going to present you with what we honestly know. And if we're not sure about information or it has not been validated, we'll tell you that as well. And that was our mechanism to try and avoid the sheer overwhelming pressure from these conspiracy theorists who just bombard social media and every other media channel they can, just producing just useless information that diverts people's attention from fixing the real issues that we know about and having to justify some address to these conspiracy theories. And I'm going to hand that back to Dean, because I think Dean was face to face with that on a regular basis as the head of the my marketing team.
Yeah, Dean, what's your comment on that, if you don't mind jumping in here?
100% what Hugh says in terms of the need for being authentic in every aspect of your communication. Also, the recognition that, you know, in previous events like this, prior to the whole digital, you know, the focus on social media, was for the most part, communication was managed by lawyers, and they would really have a guidance that would suggest you say less and you say it infrequently, just to mitigate any potential legal liability. And in the now digital space, that is the absolute opposite of what is required. You need to be able to provide information almost in real time. And the test of that is being authentic, and at least is giving the information, as you said, that you know, and not saying something that you don't know, but if you have no real information on it, you clarify it that way so that you're being authentic. Because not every, you don't have all the information in real time that all the questions are coming. So you need to qualify it by saying that, if we don't know, we're going to be finding out, or we're working on it. But the reality is that you can't hide behind it. You have to be out in front of it. The other piece of it is, what we did is we set up an amazingly huge infrastructure to support all of that communication on a worldwide basis. We had 42 individual world sites that we were updating information on in real time, providing answers and information that we could get it out there. One of the elements and challenges that we had from a cultural perspective in Malaysia was that when the event first happened, there was a sense of information not getting out quickly enough to the audiences in Beijing. And there was a perception that somehow we were holding back information or not being truthful. So there was a real test of credibility. And so anything that you said that was not 100% validated or authentic would be immediately challenged, and the credibility would be lost. So we've made a real special effort to make sure that we tested everything that we were talking about, all the communications efforts, and we ensured that that information was accurate, it was authentic, and it was clearly qualified before all those audiences received.
What's interesting, Dean, in the absence of information, people are going to make their minds up for, on what information is true and not by themselves, won't they?
Absolutely, and we found that all the time. And as Hugh refers to, is that those conspiracy theories. We were bombarded with literally tens of thousands, if not a greater number of comments that would come from wherever in the world about where the aircraft was, what happened, what we're doing, what we're saying, and so. If you don't respond, we would actually, as I was referring to, we would watch in real time how the audiences would react. So whether it be on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, we would see the activity, would see the conversations happening. And in the beginning, we sort of let it go. And what we would have is a situation where somebody would make some comment, and then everybody else would be chiming in, and it would get bigger and bigger and bigger. But as soon as we responded to it and we gave an authentic answer, people would move on and move to another topic. So it was so important to respond to things as quickly as you could with an authentic answer, and it would die. It'd kill the conspiracy conversations.
And it's interesting. Thanks for that, Marcus Osterberg. You posted a question here on the chat. I'm going to get to that in just a second because it really fits in with where the conversation's at. What we see on the screen right now is what we call the roller coaster of change. This is actually something that our group had received from a psychologist, because this is also the steps that you'd go through in coping with the loss of a loved one. Now, it's interesting because, Hugh and Dean, you look at it from the time you had that phone call, Hugh, 4:30 in the morning, which, of course, blind optimism, a little shock and denial. How long did it take you to get to the pit of despair with MH370?
Yeah, that would have been measured in just a few hours. And the reason that it wasn't quicker than that was simply because the scenario was that the aircraft was missing and we had no evidence that it had crashed anywhere or been diverted anywhere. So it was probably a matter of about 4 or 5 hours to go from blind optimism to know we really had a serious problem. And at that stage, within 5 hours, we had the Prime Minister of the country in our emergency response center working with us, contacting the Chinese agencies, contacting the Australian embassies as well, and the Australian government, because a lot of the passengers were Australian. So we made sure that we contacted all of the government authorities that were going to be impacted by that missing aircraft. But about 5 or 6 hours is typically what it took to get there.
Well, and Marcus's question is, as a leader in this situation, how did you deal with the problem of conveying confidence as a leader and dealing with the ambiguity of the situation?
I mean, that's a great question, and I'll let Dean add his point again. I think a couple of things are really important. One, you have to be competent, right? If you start panicking and changing everything you're doing based on the latest piece of information, as opposed to thinking through the information you're receiving, having a solid evaluation of it, get multiple perspectives, and then decide on a specific course of action, which is backed up by the information that you have validated, and that you get the rest of your team working behind you so you're all aligned. I think that's critical. In all fairness, when you've got such fast-moving scenarios, you can't simply follow every piece of information that's gone on there. So you look for the core pieces of information that you can base a decision on, and then you stick with that. The other thing I would add is that doesn't mean you followed that path blindly, because eventually, it may be only 24 hours later or 2 days later, as more information comes in and is validated, then you can adjust your strategy and make sure your people maintain that alignment with you. And
Well,
I'll use one example. Certain sources of information that you would normally think would be highly accurate, like information from intelligence agencies or from satellite imagery that you've received over the ocean, you would think those would be highly accurate and detailed. Unfortunately, that was not the case. We had scenarios where we had situations where people would send us satellite imagery of different parts of the ocean. They said this was taken on a certain date, it's this part of the ocean, or it's this part of the South China Sea, and you communicate that information quite honestly to recipients, only to discover a couple of days later you get a call which said, oh, sorry, that actually we gave you slightly wrong information. It wasn't taken to that part of the ocean, or it was taken on 2 days different from what they told us. So you've always got to be careful about how you respond, which is why I say be very careful about the information received, assess it properly, and even what you think would be the most reliable sources, have a pinch, just take a little bit of care before you communicate that as if it's the complete 100% the truth.
Yeah,
Dean,
and thanks for that.
Comment? Yeah.
Dean, any comment on that?
Yeah, I agree 100% with you. Obviously, one of the things that we recognize is that we, as leaders in dealing with these situations, is that you need to, as quickly as you can, formulate what a plan of action should be. It can't be purely reactionary to events, because things were moving so incredibly fast that you couldn't react in any real way. You needed to, capture the information, best information we had, validate it as quickly as we could by using various different sources and like a 360 view of it. But then ultimately shape that plan, recognizing that, again, as Hugh has mentioned, you need to adjust the plan as more information becomes available and it adjusts it. But in terms of leadership, it's so important that you have a plan, and that you're directing the activities, that you're giving comments and information, as well as direction that's based on really solid evaluation of information that you have, the best information that you have at the time, and then recognizing that you will adjust it as things go on.
Well, and you touched on that, Dean. It's interesting because what we have on the screen right now, the first step, and think about this from a COVID or from an oil price shock perspective. The first step, we've got to recognize something's gone on. Now, the second step is we have to respond to it. Then we have to plan recovery and then resume. Each one of these stages require different strategies as an organization, as a leader. In the chat function within Microsoft Teams here, put the number, and let's do a little bit of a poll of everybody who's in the call. Which stage do you think you and your team are at most as you look through each one of these? Are you responding? Are you now recovering? Are you getting back to business as usual? Or have you completely resumed business and you're at the fourth phase? So just type that in and let's see the numbers roll in as everybody puts the number into the chat function, which can be found if you put your mouse over the screen, lower third, just click on the caption box. So many at 3, some at 4. It's interesting, about a month ago when we were doing this presentation, Bob, I think we were mostly at stage 2, weren't we?
Yeah, we were firmly at stage 2, and as we progress, we begin to move into 3. It kind of looks like the average for this group is a little bit over 3. So we're in recovery, which in our terminology is what actions are you and your firms taking in the short term to return to business?
And it's interesting, Bob, because, looking at some of the data, you can go to the Johns Hopkins site. We're not medical experts, but here's some of the numbers. The US population, about 10 times the size of Canada. Number of COVID cases, it's interesting. Total in the world as of 10:26 a.m. today was just over 2 million. We hit the 2 million mark. In Canada, over 7.5 million in the world. Over 2 million in the US, 99,000 in Canada. So it's interesting because, for a full restart and a resumption of the economy, many people are saying that, of course, we do need a vaccine to get back to full business in the way we can. But we're also dealing with the second challenge being oil price shock. And we've got an image of the 5-year price chart of oil, which you see this portion towards the right here. It looks like the price chart was left out in the sun too long and just melted. And you look at where we're at now as of 10/9/24 a.m. I was at $35.70, which isn't bad. It was up a little higher before. But again, the double whammy, isn't it, Bob?
Yes,
well, it's interesting. On this slide, we had an image before. Some people, CFOs, were asked, how long do you think it's going to take to recover and get back to work? If you could just comment on that a little bit, Bob.
Yeah, and I believe that slide, the average response for a set of CEOs from a range of companies was 6 months before we returned to normal. I believe if in that survey is probably a month or so old. I do believe if we go back and resurvey, we may get a result that indicates a bit longer. I think we're discovering as firms are moving back to sort of business as usual, they're all discovering that it's not moving exactly as fast as we had hoped. So, our view is probably more like a year to recovery, and then maybe, depending upon the advent or not of a vaccine, it might be another year or two to back to business as whatever the new normal looks like.
Well, so it's interesting, Bob. One of the things, just to briefly talk about leading self, Scott and I, with a lot of the work that we've been doing together with you and Hugh, of course, as an individual, we still have to recognize, we still have to respond, we recover and we resume. What we've done is we've replaced the roller coaster with a chart that shows the emotions that we may read, that we may experience ourselves, or that we may be seeing from others as they go through the same stages. This is more of the personal emotions that people could be demonstrating at the best of times. Can you speak to this, Scott, at all?
Sure, thanks, Pat. So, kind of going back to what Hugh and Dean were chatting about in terms of, as a leader working with your teams, and a lot of it's based on the information you're getting. A lot of it is based on situations, but this is kind of an interesting little visual to maybe give you a tool to think about being cognizant of where people on your team may be at certain times. So you may have, whether we're talking about what's happening from an industry perspective, whether we're talking about people's sensitivity to the virus, whether we're talking about a tragedy like the airline disasters that Hugh and Dean were talking about, you may have a group of people on your team that are sitting on the left-hand side of the roller coaster, where they're dealing with fear, they're dealing with different threats that they're dealing with. They may be disconnected and disillusioned. You may also have other people that have been able to move on, and they've more or less accepted it, and they're kind of getting to that stage 3 to stage 4. So the point behind this visual is just to maybe give you something to think about as you're interacting and managing your teams, and being even more aware of the fact that different people are going to be in different stages of grief, or different stages of change throughout this process. And as leaders, how do we support people who may be still on the left-hand side of the roller coaster, and how do we more effectively manage those people who are already, either through the bottom of the trough and on their way up. So just a neat little visual to help you think about where people are at and how you can best help them out.
Yeah, and now Hugh, if you don't mind me asking you again, looking at whether it was MH370 or MH17, in both instances, how long did it take you to get to the, maybe to the right side of the roller coaster once you were down at that, the pit of despair down there? And Hugh, you may just be on mute there.
Sorry, apologies. With MH370, it took us about 5 or 6 hours to get to the pit of despair. It took us, we actually had maintained support for people in Beijing for at least 6 months, and it was probably another 6 months more than that to try and get through recovery. But it's difficult to measure that because MH17 happened 4 months after the MH370 loss. Mm-hmm. But the drop down to pit of despair probably took us less than 5 minutes because it was a shoot down incident, and we found out very quickly that it was our aircraft. But then the recovery period was then combined with the recovery period for MH370. So it took us quite a while. So it's not a linear graph there. The right-hand side tends to be logarithmic. It takes a lot longer to recover than it does to drop down to that bottom part of your confidence or depression. So it does take time. The other issue you should be aware of in dealing with your own people and your staff, etc., is that, as I think it was, as Scott said, people are in different phases at different times, and they spend longer in different phases. But if you've got people who are doing first responders and taking care of your team members, what we found was that we would get people through the left-hand side of the curve and get them moving up to the right-hand side to the acceptance and moving on. And then those people would leave, let's say, from our hotels in Beijing, thinking then that, okay, we've got less people to deal with tomorrow, and as we go through time, we'll get less and less people. But what actually happened was that when those original family members left and went home to their town or village, they would replace them with new family members, and they're right at the very top of the left-hand side of the curve. So our first responders were continuously cycling most people through that left-hand side of the curve, which is where more and more stress was coming on those people. So just wanted to put that in context. That may be an issue you'll be seeing here as we go through the pandemic.
Absolutely. It's interesting. One of the items we always say. Somebody can go on mute there. If Scott, if you could look after that, if that's all right. But one of the things that we give to people is, again, resilience is an interesting concept. Ensure you look after the physical items around you. The making sure you and your teams are getting sleep. The psychological, the emotional, and the community items. Not to pause on these for too long, because we'd like to talk a little bit about teams, but ensure you are looking after yourself first before leading your teams and your families. Now, it's interesting. Looking at the same 4 phases of navigating adversity, there's 4 points that we have. And, Scott, what's the number one point that you'd pick? They're all important, but what's the only one you'd pick if you picked just one?
Well, I am going to leverage the wisdom and experience of Dr. Hugh in this one and what he's talked about, which is to look after your people.
Right on. And Hugh, which one would second to that? What's another one that's very important to you? You may be on mute again.
Yep.
Apologies, everyone. I was trying to make sure there was no noise feedback. One thing I found out is that as a leader, you can't do everything. So you have to delegate authority to others. And because it's in a very unusual scenario that you're dealing with, that there's no corporate policies or guidelines you can work with, what was important is that you empower others to take on responsibility to make decisions, get things done. And then as a senior leader, you have to make sure that you have their back, because sometimes they may make decisions that you would prefer they didn't, but you can't then just critique it. You have to have their back and say, let's take it as a learning opportunity and move on. But you have to empower others so that you can adapt quickly to a very fast moving scenario.
And Hugh, these are the 4 items that you really had as a requirement going through, leading through change. Now, there's a few other tips. Again, you look through these tips. These are just a good reminder for all of us. So, and we can certainly provide this detail to each of you if you do want this information even to pass forward to some of your teams. One of the questions that just came up in the chat is, in anticipation of a second wave of COVID, would you propose any adjustment to strategy? Would you propose, what would you propose as a strategy?
Is that to me, Pat?
Yeah, if you don't mind me throwing that at you, and I'm going to go to Bob after.
Okay. Yeah, there will be recurrences now, and the recurrence of the pandemic may be at different levels of intensity depending on country, industry, region, etc. So one thing that was important, and Bob and I have discussed this extensively, is that if you spend too much time trying to focus on having, I've got 100% plan, it's bulletproof, everything will be resolved, and if we just follow this plan, we'll go forward to success. You're living in dreamland. So you need to spend time making sure you've got a robust plan, but know that it's going to change as new environments and new changes take place. So we use the example there, have an 80% plan, and then the rest of it is where it gives you the flexibility to adapt to new information coming in. So that would be my comment, and it ties very nicely into this avoid knee-jerk decision making. You do need to have a plan, but don't respond to every little change that happens. Make sure you have time to assess it and decide what is the appropriate course of action. But Bob has some really good points in this. So I'd like to hand that over to Bob.
Yeah, Bob, I'd like to hand that over to you, and then I've got a question that's been posted on the chat after you respond to the same item.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, guys. So I would pick up on the points you made about in times of great uncertainty, it's extremely important to be flexible in terms of your planning and your strategy. So we very much believe in what's called scenario planning. So worst case, we advocate firms planning for a second wave sometime in the near future, but also carefully monitoring the signposts that are indicating whether or not that wave is actually breaking on shore. So what are the rates of infections? What is the progress toward a vaccine? How are behaviors changing? And carefully monitor the significant information to inform you as to whether or not, yeah, here comes the second wave, or no, a vaccine or several have been developed. We're getting rapid immunization, and we're going to return to business, normal business, sooner than we had expected. So flexibility and scenario planning, worst case, best case.
Now it's interesting. Here's a good one for both you and Hugh. On top of price shock and COVID, my organization reacted by dramatically reorganizing all positions, authority, and reporting lines, and separating/retiring many senior employees. Any advice on leading when your mentors are suddenly absent and you're suddenly in a new position that is itself a new creation with unknown dependencies?
So wow, we changed anything more?
Wow.
Yeah, I think maybe that was bad timing, I would guess. organization in the process of restructuring, and then bam, we get the two joint crises. I think, and then you're left with the exodus of a lot of expertise. So I think, and I've experienced that early in my career during the endless waves of restructuring in the energy industry. And I think you've got to reflect on one, who's your network? Who do you know more senior, more experienced, even people who have left the firm who you can rely on for advice and coaching. I think it also increases the importance of your new leadership and to interact with them frequently as to their thinking and their advice. And then we'll talk a bit as we get into the strategy discussion. It's really important to understand what your new strategy is and to be able to translate that down to your team level or your organizational level and translate that into actions for each of the individuals under your leadership. I like one of my favorite observations about leadership is that a primary function of a leader is to give individuals and your followership hope that there's a positive future. And so that's incumbent on you, and it's incumbent on you to begin to give people specific tasks that they can work on in order to feel like and actually realize that they have some control over what that future outcome would be. Yeah. So a bit of a long answer, but over to you, Hugh.
Yeah, no, Bob has covered a lot of points, but let me add a few more. When companies, let's say use the airline industry as an example, they're probably operating at about 5% of what they did prior to the pandemic. So large numbers of airlines around the world are letting go of a lot of people. And it comes back to a lot of that is simply, if my company is losing $1 billion per month because I still have to pay all the lease costs for my aircraft, I've got crew, I've got my head office capabilities, et cetera, then they have to make some rapid decisions about what they're going to do to basically minimize cash flow out of the company. Now, it would be nice to say that people had the time to come up with, hey, we're going to restructure, here's our new vision of the future, and here's the strategy of what we're going to do to get there. And because of this new vision and new strategy, all these people that were previously in the company are suddenly redundant. I no longer need them. That is probably a challenge because the industry itself may not have changed. Now, the players in the industry may have changed and you may have to reinvent how you do your work, but frequently there is that knee-jerk component to how people make decisions. And then basically you're saying, now with my reduced workforce, we're going to have to work our way back in to the industry as the whole business environment recovers, and then we'll grow back as the business recovers. As Bob said, though, a lot of intelligence and a lot of experience has left the building because we've decided that we need to stop the cash flow going out. Otherwise, we won't be in existence when the pandemic period is over. So it is a combination of making sure, as Bob said, someone has to articulate a new vision and what's the new strategy to get there and what skill sets and people do I need to get there. And then you as the new leader who's been appointed in that one of those roles need to make sure that you do not want to be surviving through trial and error. That's something you probably can't afford to do in such a difficult scenario. Leverage the relationships you have to get as much guidance and input you can to keep your business moving and that you learn as quickly as possible.
Well, and it's interesting because, both Bob and Hugh, with the remaining people for the organizations that have gone through significant layoffs, how important is it to include as many people in the strategy process as you're able, within the leadership group? Do you just do this as a C-level function, or do you include others in the strategic process?
My experience, I'll take a first whack at it. My experience, Pat, is the firms who have the most robust, flexible, informed strategies, have a process where they have contribution of ideas and information from, I'll say, the folks in the trenches. They have a strategic oversight, overprint. And then the third element is they're looking externally for signposts, telltales, gathering as much information as they can about their industry, their environment, their competition, and the key factors that control and influence their strategy. So the most robust strategies I've seen are a combination of senior leadership input from the organization, and a really strong structured approach toward gathering industry information and trends. And you boil it all together, you come up with a number of scenarios, and you test and vet those internally.
No, it's interesting. One of the comments that was on here just briefly, all fundamentals have changed. Isn't it time to rethink old ways of doing business? What do you think of that, Hugh?
No, it's absolutely correct. Probably the most important time when you think that you're doing so well, you've got everything optimized, your products and your customer base are really good. That's probably the optimal time to start rethinking, what else do I do now? Because if I don't rethink it now, someone will overtake me very quickly. Mm-hmm. Just to re-emphasize what Bob said. So I totally agree with Bob. One other component that I think is important is, what is the culture of the company itself? Has the company been managed through a sense of fear and intimidation so that your staff only report what they think you want to hear, which unfortunately is true in a lot of businesses these days? Or do they have that sense of confidence that they can tell the bad news and the messenger doesn't get killed for providing it? If you can do that, then, as Bob said, you need to bring in all the information you need from various levels of the company, so you can put together a fully integrated plan that will work for the whole organization. But with the world changing so quickly now, it is absolutely time we should be thinking about, what will the new world look like? Have 30% of my competitors disappeared? Will the new strategy from my existing competitors, will that be about natural growth, internal growth? Or will it be about consolidation by taking over some of the other, let's say, survivors, but they're not as strong as I am, therefore I can merge them into my operation? So the whole world has changed dramatically. It is absolutely time for people to take a real hard look at what's happening. What will the future world look like? And it may be very different than what we thought it would be just 6 months, well, less than 6 months ago.
Absolutely. And Bob, you've got a few considerations. It's interesting, the strategic work that we've been doing on behalf of organizations now, even over the last few months, we've actually seen some of these points come really to the front line and become extremely important.
Yeah. A few comments, Pat.
Please.
Yeah, we believe that there's no one formula for all of the companies literally in the world. The strategic plan will be bespoke to your own company, and it will include, as you said, culture, where do you compete, and a really important observation that we're beginning to see with some of our clients who I would say are leaning into the enormous change that's going on, is they're actually looking for and thinking of this reset as opportunities to change how they do business, maybe enter new markets, re-engineer, automate processes, change how teams work. I think we will all see on the other side of this that there will be much more work from home. I think everyone's discovering that, hey, this is pretty darned efficient. And why do I have to get on an airplane to go to Kuala Lumpur when I can, we can do a Zoom meeting and accomplish the same thing? Organizations will likely be restructured to take advantage of trends like this. Your strategic plan, we talked about that previously. Every firm in the world is affected by the coronavirus. A large number are also affected negatively or positively by the changes in energy price. And that all has generally major implications for your strategy. And we also talked about communication of the new strategic plan to the leaders in the organization and the workers in the organization is extremely important, because that does two things. It gives everyone the assurance, or growing assurance, that there is a plan to get to the other side of this. And then, to the extent you as leaders can connect your employees to that plan, that gives them something tangible to do, that gives them control over that future outcome.
Well, it's interesting, Bob, it's any good plan typically has three components, and to the level of the leader who are on the call on the webinar today, it's pretty apparent that we've got some very senior leaders. Now, it's interesting, there's three components, just as a quick review before we talk about some more specifics.
Yeah, and I think, the strategy originated a long time ago with the Greeks. Strategy is a Greek word derived from stratos, which means up in the clouds. So proper strategy is you're at a higher level, you're gathering information, you're looking for weaknesses of your competition, you're looking for where you might apply your strengths. So that all has not changed. But I think what has changed, because of the great uncertainty and variability in this dual crises, is that firms need to be very, very flexible. As Hugh has said, don't focus on the 100% solution, focus on the 80%, because inevitably, if you spend the time to create a 100% solution, the environment will change and it'll be
6,000 was the last for that Harley,
so,
and 6,000.
someone who should be on mute, please.
Okay, done.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm done speaking to this slide.
Well, it's interesting. Does your company have a response plan, and what is it? We saw from the poll, the majority, if not most of people on the call today, are either at recovery and starting to think about resumption, or they're well into their plans for recovery now. So here's a few points on that topic.
Yeah.
So on this, Bob, which do you think are the important ones to touch on at this point?
It's hard to pick out just one, Pat. I think it comes as a bundle, right? Clear and consistent communication. It should be well thought and incorporate various sources of information, as I talked earlier. It should be flexible and adaptable, and it should at least envision a time frame. In our definition, response or recovery is the short-term return to business, and then resumption will be in a year plus, where things have settled out and we know what is more permanent and what is more transient.
So it's interesting, Bob. We look at some of the other questions that we posed from before. How does the recovery plan different from the response plan?
Yeah, it's going back to my previous comment, is recovery short-term, response is long-term, longer term. So like now, for example, we are all, for the most part, where we can, working at a distance, and trying to even implement that in the field. Now, as a vaccine may get proven out and a large part of the population is inoculated, it's very likely that working at a distance will go away in the field, but it's likely to become a permanent part of how we work long term. So there are some elements of the short-term recovery plan that will go away and some that will persist in terms of significantly changed work practices, like work at distance, significantly reduced business travel, work process automation, robotics. All of those categories are likely to become more permanent in the new future.
So it's interesting because, again, just to get people thinking differently, because once you start thinking different, you act different and your strategy becomes different. There's immediate, but there's also survival imperatives for some. And it may not be the organization that the leaders on the webinar here today represent. It could be your strategic partners, it could be your vendors, it could be your clients, but immediate versus survival imperatives. What can you say about this?
Yeah, and Hugh touched on this earlier, and I believe we had a question from the audience. Firms in times of crisis like this tend to react very quickly. Some might argue they overreact and then have to, recover from those actions. But the most important item here is ensuring that your company can survive as a going concern. And the most important element of that is taking actions which may be unpleasant to a number of people in terms of preserving positive cash flow. You can't run a company for any period of time if you don't have a sufficient amount of cash. So that we see as an immediate, almost immediate response. For those of us in the energy industry who have a high level of operations, supply chains have probably been significantly impacted, and a number of you have probably already dealt with. So how do we work around the unavailability of supplies, or how do we work around the fact that maybe one or two critical suppliers have gone bankrupt? So
well,
Hugh,
Bob,
any comments?
Go ahead, Hugh. Just muted out again there, Hugh.
Apologies. I keep turning it off to avoid that feedback. No, Bob has hit the major points. As a survival imperative, it's maintaining that positive cash flow. In the airline industry, because the markets have dropped so catastrophically and likely to for an extended period of time, because even if one country recovers, all international traffic requires that the other country is okay with that travel restarting. So I suspect it'll be a patchwork type environment, and that doesn't lend itself very nicely for airlines coming back. I've spoken to some airlines who think that by the end of the year they may have 40% of their business back in operation again, but even they are considering that may be optimistic, depending on how severe a resurgence of the virus might be in the fourth quarter of this year. So being prepared for it is plan for the worst and hope for the best. So companies will make those relatively tough decisions to make sure that they're able to survive, because if you don't survive, any other strategy doesn't really help you. So you have to survive first, and then you can work on your plan to be able to continue working and grow in the new environment.
Well, and Hugh, it's interesting, in the short term, you're likely to be dealing with disruptions in the following core areas. And not to be taking too much of a poke at humor, I think I will myself readjust my purchasing of toilet paper if we ever get into a pandemic situation again. But Bob, you've listed some of the critical items that key leaders should be thinking of, depending on what you've got within your organization, right?
Yeah, and this is a generic list. It's maybe a bit biased toward energy, but I'd be pretty certain that now 3 to 4 months into the pandemic and the price shock, you and your organization have been dealing with short-term issues in likely all of these areas. Operations in particular as a core work process. How do you get the company back to a core base of solid cash flow? How do teams work together at a distance? And when you can't work at a distance, like at a field site or a project construction site, how do you maintain safety? Working at a distance and Zooms and web calls have all placed enormous demand on IT and cybersecurity. So I'd imagine your firms have had to deal with that and to scale up to support the level of remote working that may be within your environment. I talked about supply chain disruptions. I think most firms are working with, hopefully successfully, putting things back together in the short term, but also longer term, looking at maybe significant rethink of what the supply chain strategy is, where you can and where it makes sense. Maybe you shorten the physical length of your supply chain, and maybe you rethink how you stock critical supplies and how you might even share those with your competition. And the last two are interesting. I noticed we have quite a variety of companies and industries on this call. Those of us who work in sales and marketing and product delivery all know that, at least traditionally, that is a high contact sport. So we're all dealing with, so how can we sell and close and support sales at a distance, at separation? And I think we're beginning to figure that out, and I do believe that this will have a permanent impact on the long-term work practices here. So likely you're all dealing with or have dealt with these major core process areas, and hopefully you've come up with a short-term fix and are now working on what are the implications for the next year or two in terms of your company, and hopefully developing and maintaining a new strategic advantage.
Absolutely. And Bob, it's interesting just taking some of the thinking we're seeing take shape within different industries. It's nice to take a look at major processes, looking at corona risk factors and determining an action plan. What can you say about this image?
Yeah, and we advocate, if you haven't already done it, go through your major processes, and maybe this may be occurring in your firm at a higher level. It may be a strategic planning function, or it may be incumbent upon you and your team in sales or maybe supply chain management to come up with your own plan. But we advocate looking at, on the left, major processes of your business, and then on the middle column, again, this is illustrative, but for each of the processes, we've gone through and did first an assessment of what's the likely impact on our standard way of working as a result of the coronavirus issues. In the case of sales and customer management, we definitely believe that's a very high impact. As I said, sales is now has been a really highly personal, person-to-person, highly interactive process. Now it's becoming, how do we do it at a distance? So we advocate then looking at the risk factors, and on the right-hand side, developing a set of actions that will help you fill the gaps in the processes, but also begin to help you position for the future and begin to think about what areas may be temporary changes and what areas may be permanent changes. So we advocate, if you haven't done it, looking at all of the major processes of your firm, going through this process, and then coming up with an integrated plan to manage the firm's recovery, but even more importantly, manage your resumption back to new business and take advantage of the areas where you can make some positive changes that may yield a new source of competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, Bob, coming back to another question, how has your competitive position changed? Again, there's probably a change to a number of each group who's on the call today. And actually, it's interesting too, because I also know that we've helped a number of people who are on the call with their virtual and online customer playbook. But here's some functional areas again. Looking at these questions, what can you speak to on this slide?
I think we've covered a lot of the points. I think, to me, the most important point is the firms who will come out on the other side of this in an improved strategic position, a new source or forced old sources of competitive advantage will approach the challenge here as an integrated project, and the integrated project will have the attention and support of the senior most management, and there will be focus teams led by really strong leaders who address the issues in the key areas that we had talked about on the previous slide, and develop and implement and measure the progress of that change plan.
And include your people in that effort too, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It goes back to my previous point about the integrated plan with detailed objectives and milestones and dates, then give all individuals in the firm an opportunity to step up and contribute to that plan.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting because one of the tools that we've actually sent out, and anybody who's attending today's call, we'll have our info at envisiongroup.ca, just our general address. We have a number of different what we call strategic pyramids, which are more of a measurement report card system to get people within your respective corporation or firm really thinking about the areas, starting with the foundational elements at the bottom. What are the foundational elements? And in this case, we chose operations, and we'll review some of the other strategy pyramids we put together. Once you've got your foundational elements, using the legend at the bottom, measure them, ensure that you're doing what you need to do to make sure that they're green and sustainable moving forward, versus on the old scale of 1 to 10, if you're 5 to 7 on these items, you're yellow, and 0 to 4, of course, red, and there may be issues. But you start with foundational elements, then you start to look at the next row up, the work controls, work improvement, continuous improvement, and high functioning operational efforts. Now, Bob, you've highlighted a few of these boxes already, and why did you choose these specific boxes?
Yeah, this assessment tool was developed and used by us pre-COVID. So if you put a COVID lens on it, the red hatched boxes are those that are likely to be most affected by changed work practices. So it's another way to look at where are the stress points resulting from the coronavirus crises, and where do we need to focus on changing, adapting, improving our work processes. So it's a second way to look at and do an assessment.
And it's interesting, the other the world-class pyramids is what we call them, whereas if you're 10 out of 10 in each one of those boxes, you're actually achieving an extremely high level of proficiency as an organization and efficiency. But we have one for the general commercial operations of your corporation, of your company or firm. Of course, we just showed you the operations pyramid. We have one designed for maintenance, for IT and technology, one for Marcom for marketing and communications, HR and talent, business development, and finance. So again, if you have interest in looking at any of those, we'll have our email address pop up in just a second. But in summary, Bob, what can you say about leading organizations?
Yeah, we've hit on all these points, and I would encourage my colleagues to chip in as I go through this. We heard Hugh say, take care of your people first, be empathetic, project confidence, and communicate. I would add to that a corollary to communicate is listen. Yeah. You will find, I think all of you have probably found in your leadership roles, that you are as much a counselor as you are a leader. People want someone to talk to and to help them think through the issues. So probably experiencing an inordinate amount of the need of folks in your organization to actually talk with you. So make the time. It's really, really important.
Yeah. And thanks for that, Bob. Any final comments, Hugh, for yourself?
No, everything that Bob has said, but we do tend to underestimate the level of anxiety in our teams. And that's mainly because we may see them at work, and we may see their persona that they present at work, but we don't know what else is going on in their lives that outside of the work environment. And that may be having a big impact on how they're performing or how they're approaching work going forward. So they're all suffering through change, not only at home, but also in what's happening at work, and their confidence level in do they have a job next week, etc. All these things will be impacting them and how they approach what's going on at the company. You're going to, as a leader, as Bob said, you need to project hope for them, but you have to be honest as well and say, what is it we're really going to be doing going forward, and make sure that when you have built a plan, communicate that so people know why we're doing it.
All right, and Scott, any final words for you?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I would say is I never want to have to follow Bob and Hugh in final words, because it's never fair to have to do that. But I really like the points that both of them made around focus on your people, and I love what Bob said about listen. I guess the best way to summarize this is this really gets into the whole leadership category of your soft skills and your emotional intelligence, and how in tune are we with being able to pick up on these subtle cues that our people might be giving us, that in terms of how they're doing. So again, I'm just going to echo Bob and Hugh in terms of your people skills and your listening skills, and just be really cognizant of that. And if you're not sure about it, there's lots of content out there on emotional intelligence and soft skills, and it's a lot of the stuff that we do at the Envision Group. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about. Hopefully it reminded you of things that you're already doing and to keep doing them. And if you aren't, hopefully it reminded you that there are some things that you can do even better as a leader to support your teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting on this call, we hope we've given you some things to think about. Now, one of the interesting items in Vision Group, our focus right now is strategy. And I know the one comment that came out, teams have been reorganized. A lot of talent is no longer with the organization in some cases, unfortunately. However, we've been spending our last 3 months assisting other organizations with strategy. If you needed help as well, we're here for you. Now, one of the other items we're continuing, for those on the call, I see a number of you who've supported our training. We've taken it online, some of the different items. We're happy to share this with you. And interestingly enough, we also have formed a partnership. The logo in the bottom right that you've seen in the shadows, we have formed a partnership with SAIT for reasons of strategic planning, and we have the sheer benefit of their applied research team, which what a great time to look for innovation and opportunity amongst chaos and challenge. And so we have that in place as well. If you have any interest, please contact us. We'd be happy to send a copy of the strategic pyramids to you if you want to take a look at those, and we're happy to contact you to walk you through how to use them in terms of strategy. But out of today, if you don't mind, we just like to say thanks to all of you. It's a troubled, challenging time where the more as leaders that we can get individuals looking forward and thinking forward, the more we're going to set ourselves up for success. And with that, I just want to say a huge thank you. We'll have the recording of the call sent out via a YouTube link after the call renders and we have it set up. But again, a sincere thank you to all of you, and all of our best of health, safety, and success moving forward. And thanks for making time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you all for participating.